Welcome to this lecture on Chapter 3, Directing, with a focus on Martin Scorsese and his 2006 film, The Departed. The screenplay for this film was written by veteran screenwriter and novelist William Monahan, and loosely based on the Hong Kong crime film Internal Affairs, as well as the real-life Boston gangster Whitey Bulger. You'll notice that the film has an A-list cast for a very specific reason. Actors want to work with Scorsese, and many actors take a pay cut from their normal salaries just to be in a Scorsese film. If we take a look at the feature films Scorsese has directed over the years, we might notice some common traits. Looking at the films from Gangs of New York to The Wolf of Wall Street, we might recognize the familiar actor of Leonardo DiCaprio. Or look at Casino all the way back to Mean Streets and you will recognize the actor Robert De Niro. De Niro was actually the first person to recommend Scorsese work with DiCaprio. Peppered throughout this list, there are plenty of other Scorsese regulars as actors. Again, actors want to work on a Scorsese picture. They know he can deliver a film that highlights their performance. And directors like Scorsese like working with the same actors repeatedly because they feel they can get further faster when they have a shorthand with an actor. He will sometimes choose a project because he thinks it would work as a good showcase for his collaboration with an actor. Scorsese has also collaborated with numerous crew members for decades, most notably his editor Thelma Schoonmaker, who has edited the vast majority of Scorsese films since 1967's Who's That Knocking at My Door. Working this way has created what could be called a Scorsese style of filmmaking, which gets us to our next topic, the auteur. An auteur is a director who serves as the primary creative force behind a film. These directors have a significant body of work that contains stylistic choices that make their style identifiable. Scorsese would most certainly be considered an auteur. Who are some other auteurs? Many responses to this question are Quentin Tarantino, Steven Spielberg, Spike Lee, and Wes Anderson, just to name a few. Each of these directors has a style that could be recognized as particular to them. However, a director's style isn't always recognizable, even among veteran directors, and much of this has to do with the amount of control that particular director exercises over the film. This can vary widely, all the way from an auteur down to a hired gun, who is merely brought in to shepherd a project through. Interesting to note that for Jaws, Spielberg was ostensibly a hired gun, having mainly directed only for television at the time. In the classical Hollywood system, producers exercised the most creative control over the finished film, and the style of the picture was that of the studio. For instance, Universal specialized in darker thrillers where MGM had grand sweeping epics. The directors were typically not even allowed into the editing room, which didn't matter so much since they were under contract and were already off directing the next film for the studio. This really changed with Orson Welles' Citizen Kane in 1941. Welles, who hadn't directed a film yet, but had made a household name for himself by directing theater and radio shows, was anxious to put his mark on the film industry as well. He collaborated extensively with cinematographer Greg Toland and shot only the exact footage he wanted in the finished film and no other coverage. This meant that in the editing room, the producers had the option to either use exactly the footage Welles gave them in the order that he wanted it assembled, or they had to pay to reshoot the footage altogether. The result was a film that looked like no other film American audiences had ever seen. Now other directors saw how they could create films that adhered to their personal style rather than the prescribed style of the studios. After the collapse of the studio system, directors began to serve more as the commanding force behind the films, and the studios became more the distributors of the films. However, sometimes the producers of the films reserve final cut for that film. Often, this is at odds with the vision of the director. Ever heard of Alan Smithee? From 1969 until 2000, Alan Smithee was the pseudonym adopted by Hollywood directors who refused to be associated with their own films because they didn't have final cut. If you check out the IMDb site for Alan Smithee, you'll find some of the worst films ever made. The Directors Guild of America retired the use of this name in 2000 when The Secret got out to the general public. Occasionally, the name will be used for films where they are edited for television or shown on airplanes since so much of the content has changed. This pseudonym illustrates how personally many directors take to losing their creative authority. Martin Scorsese is known as the master of the crime and mob movie. He was born on November 17, 1942, and was raised in an Italian-American family and grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood in New York's Lower East Side. He said that when he was younger, he was prone to illness and therefore bedridden much of the time. His mother was actually glad for this because it meant he couldn't run around with his friends who were all getting connected with the Italian mob, which was very present in his neighborhood. She thinks this illness actually saved his life. At one point, he was going to go into the seminary, but then decided at the last minute to attend New York University, where he graduated with a film degree. He He was part of what's been called the film school generation of filmmakers, along with George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, and others. They are all actually very good friends who would get together and view early screenings of each other's films and provide feedback. Some common traits among Scorsese films: he loves to explore charismatic villains and anti-heroes. Two prime examples of this are Henry Hill in Goodfellas and Frank Costello in The Departed, one of which was an actual mobster in real life, and the other one is loosely based on an actual gangster, Whitey Bulger. Part of his religious upbringing led him to be attracted to certain themes like temptation, corruption, and guilt. He loves to explore just why people are tempted to do bad things and the resulting corruption of the soul that they experience because of it. Through films like Goodfellas and The Departed, Martin Scorsese proves himself as a true auteur. Rather than simple crime or mob stories, these are intense character studies that allow him to incorporate violence into his film in a realistic and audience-engaging manner. His films are often violent, brutal, and provocative and show the darker side of society. Scorsese says that he's always trying to balance the violence shown. He doesn't want to glorify it, but he also wants to show the realism of the violence so that it can affect the audience. Scorsese likes to use a lot of the same techniques in his films. He often uses freeze frames to highlight a particular moment, usually a moment of violence, like these from The Departed. He frequently uses music from the 60s and 70s, and on numerous occasions uses the music of the Rolling Stones, especially the song Gimme Shelter, like in Goodfellas, Casino, and The Departed. He frequently sets his films in New York City, and he very often uses long tracking shots. His most famous tracking shot is from Goodfellas, following Henry Hill and his future wife Karen through the basement of the Copacabana nightclub and ending up at a newly prepared table. This technique gives the audience a feeling of intimacy with the characters. They are going on the journey along with the characters. It also highlights just how tempting this world can be, and it's no wonder that Henry Hill succumbed to the pressures and the temptations of this life as a mobster.